Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to our flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, right? So the big thing about it is we left off in class today talking about Martin Luther, his movements, and he has finally angered the Pope so much that he has been excommunicated, right? So first and foremost, I want to go ahead and give you all a quick shout out, all right? A period, okay, of course, AP European History. Great job today in class. Really love the participation. A couple shout outs to a couple kids that I thought were really doing a lot of really great work today. Alexandra, Penelope, Abby Hebler back there, not being able to catch the football, but being able to ask good questions and also answer some good questions along the way as well. Very impressed with a bunch of y'all today. Keep up the hard work. I know that this class can be intense, and I know that it's a big grind, but the big thing about it is you have to just kind of keep up with it and just enjoy the story, right? And speaking of stories, we are now getting into more of the Martin Luther Chapter 2 story, right? Not actually Chapter 2, but basically the second part of his entire journey, and this is going to be the posting of the 95 Theses moment. So what has now happened is a quick recap. Martin Luther has posted the 95 Theses, apparently, to the door of a church. Not actually true, he never actually did that. So it's more than likely a letter to an archbishop. But the 95 Theses is now circulating all through Europe. And Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, of course, the Nepo baby, as y'all call him, literally is going to excommunicate it because he tells him to recant his ideas. You got 2 months. He burns a bunch of his pamphlets. And then Martin Luther, of course, has this mic drop moment in history, which is one of the most ultimate mic drop moments in history, when he literally just burns the papal bull from the Pope, being like, this man has no authority over me, over God. Only God himself has the authority over me. And this is a huge moment, a flashpoint yet again. Multiple different movements and multiple different things will pop up because of this moment in history, and a lot of it has to do with his approach. This aggressive approach that is actually going against the church is actually going to earn Martin Luther a lot more followers, okay? Like, a lot more followers are going to, kind of clam on to him and begin to follow with him. Now, all the people standing around here in this area are either German monks or they're another type of person known as a German prince. This one being a very that's way too close. This one being a very famous one, a man by the name of Frederick the Wise, right? He's one of the electors, one of the people that actually chose Charles V to be, chose Charles V to be, one of the Holy Roman Emperor, one of those people that they actually got bribed by the Habsburg family. When we're looking at this, Frederick the Wise is one of the German princes that is going to be there when Martin Luther burns this papal bull. Now, in this moment when this goes down, Martin Luther is going to basically be showing these German princes that if you literally just do not go with the actual church and or follow the political procedure, you can actually gain more power for yourself. Now, the interesting part about this is that means that actually a lot of nobles and princes are going to start converting to Lutheranism first and bringing their workers and the people that live on their land along with them. The German princes will come out to be very important as time goes on. Just knowing more than anything else is that they are the ones who own and control huge amounts of land in the Holy Roman Empire, okay? So the Holy Roman Empire isn't even technically a country or a kingdom. It's a giant conglomerate of principalities, right? And each of those principalities is led by a prince. And when Martin Luther is basically doing all these really aggressive things, he's showing them that you don't have to listen to the Holy Roman Emperor if you maybe become a different religion. And so they're going to become a very important thing popping up. Speaking of German princes, one of them said that apparently 9/10 of all Germans have now accepted Luther's ideas and are following him. And the other the other 1 out of 10 are saying death to the court of Rome, right? Which Penelope in class today got a really good job kind of identifying the fact that basically this is a jeer or a stab or a poking at the fact that basically a lot of people are believing by this point, a lot of people that are very intense are believing that the Vatican has just become a court and that the Pope is no better than any king, right? And that he's basically just holding parties and flaunting his wealth and he's doing all these things that kings get caught up in when it comes to worldly affairs. So a lot of people are saying, we may not like Luther, but death to the court of Rome, right? Which is going to be a very famous popular line. Now, going into it, though, as well, something that you have to understand is that now that Martin Luther is excommunicated, the Pope's reach is pretty much gone. Leo X can't do much more at this point because what's he going to do? Excommunicate him again? No. Now that he's not a part of the church anymore, he basically, in essence, is already out. And then, basically the Pope has condemned him to hell. Even though, by the way, fun fact, Martin Luther's super paranoid about hell. Some of his writings and stuff like that, he's super upset about a lot of the way his life's gone, and he's really worried and paranoid that he's going to go to hell all the time. And he, really grapples with it constantly. And I'll tell Mr. Mathern to bring that up to y'all because y'all do talk about him quite a bit in religion going forward when you get to the Reformation, when you talk about the history of the church, right? So the thing about it, though, is that now that Martin Luther is out of the church, that leaves it up to Charles V, the young, by this point, about 20, 21-year-old Holy Roman Emperor, to try and stop a movement that could rip his kingdom apart, right? Now, interestingly enough, Charles V is Spanish, first of all. So he's Spanish, but he rules over all these different lands due to those marriages of convenience. Remember, he is the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. He is a very important, crux individual. He is the delta in this entire thing. He is going to be the one that basically, if he's going to fix everything, it's got to be him. So what he ends up doing is he holds what's known as a diet, all right? Or a diet is what we're going to say. We're not going to say diet. So diet is literally how you say it in German. So a big thing, no, actually, diet is how, or debt, we'll look at this later. Now, anyway, diet of worms. All right, now look, so speaking of, though, also, it's not worms, it's supposed to be Worms. All right, so because it's in Germany, a small town in Worms, Germany, out near Nuremberg. Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is the Diet of Worms was a meeting called by Charles V where he basically was going to hold an inquisition for Martin Luther and force him to recant his ideas, right? Charles V holds this meeting with a council of other clergy members where they literally bring Martin Luther in and call him in to defend his ideas, and they basically are going to prosecute him and decide what to do with him, criminally speaking, after this. Now, in this moment, he is given the opportunity to recant his ideas and go back on them to save his own life. Now, several different things happened over this several day-long meeting. Also, interestingly enough, there was a lot of other things. There was a lot of other things on the itinerary, on the sheet that they were supposed to do at the Diet of Worms. They were supposed to do a bunch of different stuff, and Martin Luther was only one of those things. But the thing about it is, though, again, everybody thought they were just going to be able to easily kind of threaten this guy and that he would take back all the stuff that he did. And there was one moment where literally one of the Catholic priests that was there as part of the Inquisition, took out 25 books, and stacked them all up and said, Martin, did you write these? One. And do you take back the ideas in them, too? So basically just kind of answered his question for him. So the thing about it, though, when we're getting into it, they asked him this, and they made him speak in both German and Latin the entire time, bouncing back and forth between his two different answers. Now, the big thing about it, though, is Martin Luther did eventually accept it. He actually had a chance to take everything back. And this is a very, very big moment in Martin Luther's life. Because if he would have actually taken everything back, then nothing would have actually happened to him, right? He might have been arrested or whatever, but he might not be burned at the stake or anything like that, like Jan Hus got happened to him. So what ends up going down, though, is Martin Luther is given 24 hours to recant all of his ideas. They show him the big stack of books, and they're like, all right, you got 24 hours to figure out if you're going to take this back or not. And if you don't, we're going to condemn you as a heretic. And if you get condemned as a heretic, you are basically going to die, almost no question, and probably be tortured at some point. So going into it, though, he comes back after a day, and he racked his brain, and according to some of his personal writings, he thought he was very close to taking everything back. He was very, very close to it. But then he came back and he said, I'm going to separate these piles of books into several different stacks. And the stacks included things like criticisms of the church and things on church corruption, and then also just things that are about Scripture itself, right, which is the big stack, was all just things about Scripture and how indulgences aren't anywhere in it, and then also how some of the things the Catholic Church is doing is not anywhere in Scripture whatsoever. So in essence, what ends up happening is Luther refuses to take those demands back, and he refuses to recant his ideas. And he has a very famous quote where he says this, and in this process, Charles V condemns him as a heretic and says, we will give you safe passage back to Wittenberg, Germany, and you can go back to your hometown, where you will then be arrested and you will be put on trial for heresy. And being put on trial for heresy is a pretty big deal. But in that moment, when he refused to take anything back, he said, don't write this. This is just a quote. He said, unless I am convinced by evidence of Scripture or by plain reason, I cannot and will not recant anything, for it's neither safe nor right to go against conscience, right? And he's basically saying that God is speaking through my conscience, telling me that I am not wrong, and that basically the Bible is the one source of truth when it comes to the growth of the church and the growth of the soul, right? So the thing about it is he takes it back, and what ends up going down in this entire process is this does not actually make Martin Luther look like a bad guy, it makes him look like a cool guy. And so the thing about it is this approach of him denying the church, denying the request of Charles V to recant his ideas and basically becoming the very first Protestant reformer, his followers would then be known as Lutherans. And the beginning of the church is said to the beginning of the Lutheran church is said to emanate out of the Diet of Worms, right? Or the Diet of Worms. So now look, getting into it though, this earned him an even bigger audience. And while he was on his way back, he was snatched up, literally taken hostage, basically, but in a good way, all right? So, not taken hostage in a bad way, not kidnapped or anything like that, but basically kidnapped. What ends up happening, though, is he is snatched up by that same guy that was in the painting earlier, Frederick the Wise, the great elector, right? So Frederick the Wise snatches him up and takes him back to his castle, where he literally starts putting him into hiding in 1521, and Martin Luther is now on the run, and he is an outlaw, right? So the interesting thing about it, though, is that who is going to hide him but these German princes? And we'll talk about that more here in about 2 seconds. And in this process, when he goes into hiding underneath Frederick the Wise's homes and where he's being bounced around different castles and things like that, he begins doing something very, very intense, where he begins to translate the New Testament into German, okay? And he begins to actually create the idea where everyone that follows me should be able to read this scripture and read it for themselves and not depend on a priest to translate it from Latin. Now, this is a big moment in the cataclysmic movement that is now being known as the Reformation officially, right? Now, Protestantism is going to begin to spread, and it's going to spread pretty quickly. Even though Luther is in hiding and he can't be out in public or else he's going to get arrested as a heretic and stuff like that, Protestantism is spreading, and they are also finding a lot of priests that had similar ideas to Luther that were in hiding before Luther ever came out, and before Luther ever did the Diet of Worms, before Luther ever wrote the 95 Theses. You really think right now that Martin Luther was the only monk running around with any of these ideas? No, of course not. So whenever some of these monks actually hear some of these ideas, they want to meet with him, and they want to talk to him and stuff like that. And so Protestantism is going to spread. Now, don't write this down. This is just a review. Because look, he's not the only one that actually pointed out some problems with the church, okay? Erasmus is the very first one to translate the Bible into Greek when he wasn't supposed to, right? And he stayed an ardent Catholic his entire life. And then Sir Thomas More also stayed an ardent Catholic his entire life, wrote the Utopia because he thought the private property of church leaders was leading to corruption and we were going away from Christian moral values in society, right? So now look, getting into it, wow, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right, Grace. Maybe I do talk a little too fast. But anyway, quick review. Erasmus and Sir Thomas More have been saying things like this a long time. So then people like Ulrich Zwingli pop up. Ulrich Zwingli is another another monk that has now derivated his way away from the Catholic Church, who believes in a lot of things that Martin Luther is saying, and he also has some of his own personal ideas. And so he actually meets with Luther while Luther is hiding out at a place called Marburg Schloss. Now, Marburg Schloss means like Marburg Castle. Schloss is castle in German. So now what ends up going down, though, is while Luther is in hiding, Ulrich Zwingli goes and meets with him. And there's a very, very huge moment when they actually meet with each other. And it's a huge event, and it happens, when did that happen? Marburg meeting. Zwingli. There we go. I refer to it oftentimes as the Marburg argument, but a lot of people call it the Marburg colloquy. And so that happens in 1529, so about 8 years after Martin Luther has already been in hiding and he's been translating a lot of different Latin works into German. Ulrich Zwingli shows up and he goes and he meets with him, and he wants to do what Erasmus was doing, right? He wants to take Erasmus's text and he wants to teach the Bible from his New Testament from A to Z, basically not leaving out any sermons, any psalms, any scripture whatsoever. He basically wants to take it even a step further than Martin Luther already is. And he agrees with Luther on a lot of different things, like corruption and the Mass and indulgences and scripture and all these other things. But what ends up happening is this is a moment known as kind of the Marburg argument, right? Where in the Marburg Schloss, or the castle, they start disagreeing with each other and they actually start arguing, right? Towards the end of it, Martin Luther kind of shows his true colors, and he actually says in some of his personal writings that he didn't like Zwingli, that he thought he was arrogant and foolhardy and stuff, and that he was challenging the authority that Martin Luther had already kind of earned for himself. Martin Luther literally did not get along with him in this meeting, and they end up disagreeing on one massive thing, the Eucharist. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but it leads to an early split in Protestant thought. And it demonstrates to us, like we talked about in class today, that new Protestant figures are going to begin to show up, and that Protestantism is based on the idea of leaving a church. So you're going to end up with tons of different branches of Protestantism, right? So Protestantism is a giant umbrella that includes all those different things that we were listing in class. Episcopalian, Methodist, and non-denominational, and Baptist, and Wayward Baptist, and Primitive Baptist, and the Amish are technically a Protestant. They're called an Anabaptist, right? And this moment is even actually a part of modern day art. This is actually in Marburg, outside of Marburg Castle, this is actually a painting that somebody did, or a graffiti that somebody did, of Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther arguing with each other. Now, going into it, we're going to pause real quick, okay? We're going to stop the history stuff for about 2 seconds, and we're going to begin instead to talk about Protestant thought, right? We're going to start talking about Protestant thought, different ideas, and then also basically what is it about Protestantism that's causing it to spread so quickly, right? The thing about it is, so people who cling to the ideas of Zwingli, Erasmus, Luther, and others are what's known as Protestants, okay? Now, ironically enough, Erasmus, not a Protestant, Erasmus stays a Catholic for his entire life, okay? So just keep that in the back of your mind.
But a lot of his ideas that he expanded on in the praise of folly and the corruption of the church and stuff like that, if you followed his ideas and then Luther's ideas or Zwingli's ideas, you're known as a Protestant. And where that word comes from is a protestor, right? Exactly, all right? Protestant, a protestor against the church, okay? Now, you're going to see a lot of different movements that include Protestant action and like different ideas, okay? Lutherans weren't heavy into this, but a later on one is going to be really, really big, known as Calvinists and stuff like that. Things known as iconoclasms, okay? I don't think you understand going into it, but literally during this entire movement, when the Protestant Reformation is raging throughout all of Europe and ripping entire communities apart and sending churches asunder, you're going to see these things break out called iconoclasms, okay? Write that down, all right? It's a very important word. Iconoclasm. Iconoclasm. An iconoclasm, what it is one sect of Protestants and several other sects of Protestants believe that the church has grown far too wealthy and that they were like covering these different churches in art and sculptures and things that were seen as gaudy and just kind of ostentatious and not necessary. And the thing about it is a lot of them believe that it went against Scripture as well. And so they started running into these churches, breaking the faces off the fronts of statues. If you actually come to France, like this summer, there is like a very church we'll go to where you can see the faces of statues have been smashed off because in the 1550s, during the French Wars of Religion, the church was attacked by like Protestants, and an iconoclasm happened, right? So you're seeing this idea of protesting become very vivid, very intense, and even also branching into property damage as well. Now, going into it also, don't write this down. This is just kind of a little element to kind of help you understand it. German princes who met later on at this thing called the Diet of Speyer in 1529 and protested the decisions from Rome, eventually the word grew to refer to all like non-Catholics from Western Europe, right? So that's where the word Protestant actually comes from, is these protesters against the church, perpetrating these iconoclasms and actually going against the church and creating their own new ideas. Protestant ideas, though, are also very important. What if you were to try and cook it down into 4 things that make the Protestants so incrementally different from the Catholics, right? Well, what it is one, God, they believe, initiates salvation, not people, okay? And so this is considered a part of like Luther's idea of grace alone, right? Grace alone is the idea that you, because of God's will get into heaven, not due to the intermediary actions of a priest, right? So we talked about this in class a little bit when we were talking to y'all about like y'all are baptized Catholic and stuff like that. For you to be able to get into heaven using like your different sacraments according to Catholic ideology and dogma is you basically have to take this piece of bread, right? And a priest must bless it, which has now been turned into a piece of Christ, which is then given to you as a part of your sacrament. And without the priest there, you can't get any of these things. And without the sacraments, according to Catholic dogma at the time, you wouldn't go and get into heaven, right? So basically, Protestants are like, no, God initiates these things. It is not man necessary, and you don't need certain people to actually be there the ones to do it. As long as you have a good relationship with God personally, he will be the one that absolves you. Now, this goes against Catholic Church because it kind of goes against the ideas of the sacraments, and it goes against the methodology of the church as well, and tradition also. And the other big thing about it is, number 2, authority of the church lies only in the Bible. Protestants believe that literally the authority of the church should not be translated from another human being and then parceled out to you. You should go and read it for yourself, and that's that scripture alone piece. Why does this go against the Catholic Church at the time? Because the Catholic Church believed that all the Bibles must stay in their original Latin text, right? Well, even though it wasn't even originally written in Latin, it was originally written in Aramaic, but don't even get me started on that. But the biggest thing about it, though, is the Catholic Church wanted the Bible to stay written in non-vernacular languages in Latin, and also wanted priests to be the ones that delivered it to people. Whereas Protestants are like, no, Scripture alone is the way for you to understand God. You should go out there and you should read it for yourself. The other big thing about it as well, and so this is going to advocate a lot for vernacular Bibles. That means that every single time a Protestant sect pops up in a different country, they're going to demand that the Bible be written in their language, right? The church also, they believe, lies in every believer, not in a physical location. This is an element of faith alone, that you do not have to go to church to necessarily receive the goodness of God. Your faith between you and him is what actually makes everything work. It's like direct line. You don't have to go to confession to actually cleanse your soul. As long as you can pray and speak to God one-on-one, he will understand, and your faith will be the thing that gets you into salvation, right? Why does that go against Catholic Church? Because again, it's eliminating the priest, it's eliminating the dogma, and it's eliminating the tradition of the physical location of church, and also it can negatively affect them financially speaking, because if you don't go to church, you're not paying your tithe, right? Now, going into it though, lastly but not leastly, every person has a calling. No one is better than anybody else, right? So this is a big thing because it's protesting clergy hierarchy, and also it's protesting financial and economic hierarchy throughout Europe as well, which is going to blow up in everybody's face here in about 2 seconds, okay? Now, do Protestants agree on everything, all right? So this is a very, very important thing to understand when we're looking at people like Zwingli and Luther and later Calvin and John Knox and Henry VIII and all these other figures, right? Do Protestants agree on everything with each other? No. So, like, trying to act like those 4 things are necessarily going to be the guiding light and keep all Protestants happy and faithful and together and, like, not fighting one another is not true, right? Like, it's not going to be a big thing at all. The big example of this is the transubstantiation dispute, or the Marburg argument, or Marburg argument that I refer to it as. The Marburg argument at Marburg Schloss, Catholics, of course, believe something, Luther believes something, and Zwingli differed from them as well. Catholics believe that after the priest consecrates the bread and the wine, it becomes a bit of Christ, right? And that's a part of that idea of transubstantiation. Luther, on the other hand, believes that Christ is present in the Eucharist and the wine, but because of God, not because of the priest, and also that basically spiritually he is there, not physically. Whereas Zwingli is just like, that's bread. Like, so, like, Zwingli's like, I mean, it's bread, dude. Like that's bread, and we are just kind of spiritually practicing this idea. It's tradition, and it also makes us understanding of the fight and the actual, like, tribulations that actually Christ went through in his life leading up to his eventual crucifixion. Zwingli's like, it's ceremony, man. It's not necessarily a bit of Jesus. Like that would be kind of like, So, like, literally, as you can see, Protestants don't agree on everything, right? And you're going to see a massive fissures about, like, of their ideas going forward. Now, the thing about it, though, also, is this is the last thing we'll talk about today, and we'll wrap everything up. There is a big myth that ran around during the Protestant Reformation. Protestants believe that Protestant ideas appeal to the poor, not to the wealthy. And that is actually a myth, because the fact of the matter is, by 1650, all classes of people have begun to reject Catholic thought, and you're seeing people like princes, nobles, well-to-do individuals, economically high-standard living people are going to be literally growing in their ideas of Protestantism, right? And the reason why is because Protestantism has a lot of appeal. It appeals to everybody, regardless of your class. Protestant thought is easier. It's a lot less complicated, right? 2, less ceremony, more faith. Vernacular Bibles that everyone believes that you should read it on your own, which is actually going to, interestingly enough, turn a lot of old school monks, right? Clergy should pay taxes and be civically responsible. Pictures in the printing press is going to be big, because now that we have vernacular Bibles, a big thing that's going to be happening as well is you can use the printing press to add pictures to that text, right? So people can actually read it and make it more accessible. So also going into it as well, the printing press is now making a lot more of them, like, available, which is giving more people the ability to actually read more. And what is the first book they're going to gravitate towards, but other than the Bible? The Protestant work ethic is a big thing as well that Protestantism appeals to. Rich people like the Protestant work ethic because it keeps poor people working, and poor people love the Protestant work ethic because it's the idea that if you work really, really hard in your life, that God will reward you with, like, things like financial security and then also a movement up in life. The Protestant work ethic is going to be a really big thing going forward and a little bit later on, and it kind of relates a lot to old school German culture when it comes to work ethic. All right, so now celibacy and priest marriage as well. This is another big thing. Protestantism appealed to a lot of priests at the time because under Protestantism, most of the sects agreed that you could get married, right? So, like, now this is big, right? They rejected the idea of celibacy because they said it goes against human nature to have to, like, necessarily be monogamous your entire life in the devotion of yourself to God. And they actually believe that priests should be allowed to get married and have families of their own. Now, also, this brings up the question of divorce, though, and that's a big thing as well. Protestants at the time still believed that divorce was awful and you should never do it, right? So, like, and that literally, like, marriages are meant to be bound together for life because of the union with God, right? But interestingly enough, the Protestants were much more easygoing about abandonment or any kind of physical abuse. And they were like, oh, no, that's fine. You can get divorced and go find somebody else, right? So, like, now, think about it, though, as well. Later on, you're going to see disputes pop up as well, though, between Protestants continuing forward, like alcohol and morals and stuff like that. For example, Martin Luther said, alcohol cures all woes, and he actually advocated for heavy drinking. Whereas later on, John Calvin is going to lash out against alcohol, and he's going to call it the devil's drink, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, Luther and his ideas appealed to so many people that German princes in the Holy Roman Empire actually hid him and protected him. This is going to massively backfire on him later, and we'll talk about that in class when I see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.